Hello, everybody. We just had a very glorious weekend. Bit of rain today, but it's going to shape up to be another few sunny days in Queensland. And when we have nice weather, well, which we have most of the days in Queensland, everybody goes where? They go to the beach. So today we talk about probably humanity's favorite marine ecosystem, sandy beaches. Now, I am a sandy beach ecologist, and often people say, "Oh, you actually work on beaches. It must be so fantastic." Well, it is. And usually we shouldn't really need to justify our existence because by and large it is sandy beaches which underpin more livelihood. Hello, everybody. We just had a very glorious weekend. Bit of rain today, but it's going to shape up to be another few sunny days in Queensland. And when we have nice weather, well, which we have most of the days in Queensland, everybody goes where? They go to the beach. So today we talk about probably humanity's favorite marine ecosystem, sandy beaches. Now, I am a sandy beach ecologist, and often people say, "Oh, you actually work on beaches. It must be so fantastic." Well, it is. And usually we shouldn't really need to justify our existence because by and large it is sandy beaches which underpin more livelihoods in the coastal setting than any other marine ecosystem. Beaches are something we are drawn to, and you can take hundreds, thousands of images around the world of coastal settings where people flock and use beaches. This is in northern Chile. This is another picture from Chile, and you can actually see that many coastal cities grew up around sandy beaches, and there are meccas of tourism. This, on the other hand, is in Australia. You can again see the Gold Coast. As they say, the Gold Coast is sunny place for shady people, but let's not go on about this one. Developed around the golden sands of southeastern Queensland. Just goes, to show how bizarre basically our use of sandy coastlines has become. And of course, particularly in Australia, we have, and in California, to some extent in Spain and in France, we have developed this real distinct beach culture. Here we see Mooloolaba on Australia Day. It wasn't actually that crowded this year, but again, where do people flock to when they have to celebrate big events in a coastal zone where there's lots of beaches? To the sands. And of course, our beach culture is also very much expressed with things like surf lifestyle, quite iconic. Sandy beaches are also the marine ecosystem or the coastal ecosystem where we have arts events, as we have here on Cottesloe Beach, but they're also intensely beautiful. I have to say, when we turned around the corner in Parque Azul in Chile here, and I stopped there and stared across this bay, and I have seen many a sandy beach in my life, it just takes your breath away, really. And this is also a particularly nice beach if you actually look at all the little hummock dunes here, getting, transitioning over to slightly larger dunes into a desert environment. And again, people who have nowhere else to go, they make those little beach shacks. They don't actually erect them on a rocky shore, they actually erect them on a sandy beach. Closer to home, this is the view down from Noosa towards the Sunshine Coast. And again, this is some of the most expensive real estate in Australia, Sunshine Beach. Of course, in not so long a time, they will all, trundle down as climate change will actually eat those dunes away. But this is actually a lecture we're going to have a little bit later. And the Sunshine Coast is a particularly good example to illustrate the importance of beaches, because nobody will argue with us if we say, well, if all of that were just seagrass meadows or mangrove swamps or rocky shores, the coast would not be one of the most rapidly expanding, growing suburban conflagrations in Australia. Here's North Tropic Island again. Very few people would not be attracted to this kind of environment. And no matter where you go, you always get the same kind of juxtaposition of the sea out here, a gentle sloping beach, which is actually good for all sort of recreational opportunities. And here this is up in the Daintree, a more tropical setting. Some beach cultures or expressions of beach culture, as you can see here, those blokes built themselves a bar to have some bundies and rum, basically at sunset, are very, very difficult to comprehend, and some of them are quite despicable, really, in terms of the racist overtones they have, but nevertheless, people identify with that. But today, you should actually walk away from this lecture, and particularly at the end of this course, with an intense appreciation that beaches are some of the most spectacular, biologically rich and dynamic ecosystems. Beaches are not just a pile of sand. And I have spent many, many years sort of working on beaches now, and I still go out to the field every single day and come back in wonderment. My students often say, oh, Thomas, don't you get actually sick of working on beaches? I says, no, there's not a single day you can actually spend on a beach as a biologist and not come home with some more good idea, new observations, fresh looks, more enticing angles. It's always exciting. And it doesn't really matter whether you work on birds or on invertebrates or even on things buried on the sand, as this wonderful bodyhead I discovered a few years ago. And also, beaches are fucking fantastic because you can actually bury your dog in it. Look at it. That's my ex-dog, Ishi. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. And he amused a great many students. And of course, you can also take a more poetic approach to beaches, such as this opening stanza in a book by Willard Bascom. The beaches of the world are cleaned every night by the tide. A fresh look always awaits the student, and every wave is a masterpiece of originality. It will ever be so. Go and see. Now, let's sort of start the science. I can't babble on about the values of beaches for hours and hours. You're actually here to learn something about beach ecosystems. Now, from a purely geological point of view, isn't that a great photo we took last year of some mullet fishermen down on Stratty? I wonder who the photographer is. Never mind. Basically, a beach is a pile of sand. And that sand is deposited by waves, and it gets shaped by waves, by tides, and also that shaping depends by the properties of the sediment itself. People argue about where a beach stops and where it ends on the landward side and on the seaward side, but basically it goes out to sea often a few kilometers, and the landward limit of a beach is usually at the base of the dunes, although functionally the dunes are also part of it. Now you can have a diagram like that, and people usually say, oh, the beach is just this bit up here, basically between the waves or the swash and then the dunes further upland. In reality, however, a beach can actually extend out to sea up to a few kilometers, and that depends on the wave energy. On coasts with very large waves, they can actually move sediment right down to about 30 meters, and that actually defines the seaward limit of the beach. If you want a bit of a classification between the different parts of a beach, although we have to realize they change depending on wave size, they also change depending on swell conditions, and they change depending on sediment supply. A very, very rough distinction usually recognizes three different parts. And again, I stress that the boundaries here are very, very flexible. We have a nearshore zone of waves shoaling, where the waves basically start to approach the shore and they start to interact with the seabed. That actually means they become peaked and eventually break. Then we have that zone where the waves break often multiple times and eventually transform themselves into a swash bore, and that swash bore, as the swash zone, runs up the beach towards the base of the dune. Now, quite often people say, oh, the beach is really between the base of the dune about here and about here. Well, as a beach geologist or geomorphologist, and also as a biologist who recognizes the importance of water movement and geological structures, you would of course say, no, it's not quite true. The beach actually goes much further out. As a matter of fact, it can actually move seawards for a kilometer, 2 or 3. And that outermost, or that most oceanic, if you will, part of beaches is called the nearshore zone. Now, what actually happens in the nearshore zone is that the waves come in and they start, what we actually say, feel the bottom. And that depth at which wave energy can mobilize sediment from the bottom up into the water column is called the closure depth. Now, the closure depth basically depends on the size of the waves. When you have reasonably large waves, anything from 2 to 3 meters, it can actually go right down to about 30 meters. You can actually experience closure depths when you dive just outside the surf zone and you go down to the seabed. What you will actually experience is that the waves move you back and forth. And that movement is every time a wave passes over you, there's orbital motions, and as the orbital motion of the water particles nears the seabed, it actually transforms into a back and forth swaying motion. Never mind what the form of that swaying motion is, the fact is it actually transports sediment. And this is quite important because whenever you have beach erosion, people say, oh, where has the beach gone? But it hasn't disappeared. It actually just moved a little bit offshore, and it will come back. Unless, of course, it gets transported in a longshore direction, then goes down into the deep sea or some similar process. Now, a little bit more familiar to most people has been part of the beach, particularly in parts of Australia, California, France, Brazil, where people surf. People also surf in Norway and Iceland, slightly nutters, but never mind, is the surf zone. And the surf zone is basically that part of the beach, I put a red arrow here, which is characterized by the waves actually breaking. Now, when do the waves start to break? You can actually work this out very, very simple. Must be one of the most simple formulas. When the water depth gets shallower than 1.5 times the wave height, the waves start to break. Now, surf zones can be up to several hundred meters wide on highly exposed coasts. They're the most dynamic, the most physically intense of all the beach zones. And what many people don't really know, unless you're a surfer, is the seabed underneath the surf zone is not flat, but it actually has a series of topographic features most notably usually an outer bar. Then we got a trough, another bar, another trough, and several of those until basically you hit the beach. There's also channels, there's little terraces which develop at low tide. So it is a morphologically, geomorphologically, topographically very, very diverse part of the coastal environment. Last but not least, we call this the Swash Zone, as well. I say literally, mostly geologists call it the Swash Zone. In reality, it is the Swash Zone where the last bit of the breaking wave transforms into a swash bore, and that swash bore runs up the beach until basically the water has filtered either into the sand or returns via gravity flow. Of course, during storm conditions, it can be right up here, during high tides somewhere around this line here. Now, when we talk about beach morphodynamics, the most simple way to actually understand that is to think about a beach as the product of two opposing forces. The one is basically the swash running up the beach, and the other one is the back swash running down the beach. Now you might say, well, this is a bit simple. Well, it is, but consider the following. Ultimately, beaches are formed by having slightly more accretionary, i.e. forces which deposit sand and leave it in place, than erosional forces. Now, every time a wave comes in, it takes a little bit of sediment towards the land, trying to form a beach. But the return flow to the sea, the backswash, takes some of that sediment with it. Now, it just happens to be the case that essentially the backswash is usually a tiny little bit weaker. Why? Because water actually filters into the sand and returns underneath through the sand prism. And that basically continues the existence of beaches. It also basically means that the very, very most simple descriptor of different beach states is actually the slope. Steep slopes have a very, very different habitat characteristics compared to more gentle slopes, largely because they have different sediment sizes and largely because they have a different flow regime on the beach face. The beach face is basically the part of the beach facing the incoming waves. Now here you have a picture of a fairly rough beach with cobbles and seaweed being washed up here. That's in the northern part of Scotland, and we call those kind of beaches which are very steep with rough sediment, with coarse sediment, reflective. Now, a reflective beach is not necessarily one which sits, around the coast and say, what am I? What will I become? Does my existence as a beach have any lasting meaning? Will I actually exist in perpetuity? Will I erode? Well, actually, it has no such. What's the meaning of life? What's the answer to life? 42. No, beaches are not really all that introspective. They don't really have major philosophical debates with themselves. The name reflective comes from the fact that waves often come in and they reflect off the beach. They get bounced back. The other one is a dissipative beach, and you see here a classic dissipative beach one which we will actually visit during our field trip to Fraser Island, which essentially is much flatter. It has a wide surf zone, and it basically is a very different beast when it comes to the swash flow up the beach face here. Also, if you look at this beach here and that one here, it actually explains why we have all the pumps coming and immigrating to Australia, including me as an Australian, because our beaches are just basically the best ones in the world. Right. Let's see what we can. So this would be a textbook representation or a diagram from a textbook about reflective, what a reflective beach looks like in a cross profile. What you actually have to note here is we have very, very coarse particles, usually a few millimeters across. That means there's also lots of spaces because they don't back very nicely. They're highly permeable, so the water comes up and a great deal actually filters through the water body and returns to sea at about this level here. Wave action can be strong, but the beach is steep because the backswash is not very well developed because the water filters into the sand. So there's actually not a strong current taking the water away out of the beach face. Now, what is actually very interesting is that the surf zone is usually not well developed, 10 meters, 20, sometimes it's even a few meters, so the waves come in and they actually bounce back off the beach face. Now, one thing you basically might think is a bit of a disadvantage being a beach ecologist is you can go nowhere on holidays without taking 100,000 photographs every day because you're just so eternally fascinated by different beach shapes. This is, of course, the most extreme example of a beach. It's a boulder beach in Chile. This might be, and you can actually see there's very, very large particles and water filters in here at an enormously great rate. Of course, this is not a common situation on many parts of the coast, but what can be much more common is this kind of reflective beach. You can actually see here the surf zone not very wide, and it's a really, really coarse environment. What really actually shocked me once I started looking at this photograph I took, and it was last year in Chile, just before COVID hit. I just sort of basically for, size, this is, my foot here is the enormously well-developed cycling legs, is look at the amount of plastic actually. And this is a reasonably remote part of our planet. And this is the other extreme. It's a wide beach. Look at the surf zone, multiple breaking, but it's that gradual slope. It's the Park Azul Bay here. I really quite like this part of the beach here. And a more boring textbook example would actually display something like this. It's a gradual profile, i.e. the beach slope is not very steep. It's much flatter than in the other one. There's very little wave action. The spaces in between the sand grains are much more packed, so water has a greater problem filtrating into it. And essentially, the waves break multiple times in the surf zone, and eventually only a very gentle swash bore goes up the beach, which produces a laminar flow, and that laminar flow is much more conducive However, we don't really want to look at diagrams when we discuss beaches. It's actually sometimes much more easy to illustrate that with, when we go into the field, or when we basically even, take casual photographs as you basically visit sandy beaches. Here's a classic photograph of a high energy sandy beach, which is dissipative. We have an enormously broad surf zone, and what you can actually, that's probably 300-400 meters across here, and what you can actually see, the waves come in here, they break for the first time, spill out, they go into a trough, they form a second time. This can actually happen 3 or 4 times, and eventually they actually run up the beach as very gentle swash bores. Another example from Sunshine Beach. Again, look at the gentle, swash up here. What is also quite interesting, you can see very, very nicely the massive rip currents out here, and look at this mother of a rip. We actually mapped all the rip currents along the Sunshine Coast from satellite imagery and put them in relation to surf life-saving flags, but I'm probably drown when I actually tell you what the outcome of that one was. Another one here on Stretty, you can actually see the waves just coming in here, waiting for the next one, and then actually spilling up Dissipative Beach, and here Fraser again. So essentially, dissipative beaches are the ones which are wide with a gentle slope, with a laminar flow. And those are the ones which we often find as people for recreational purposes to be the most attractive one. Here is a truly astonishing figure, 3 figures for you. If you were to stand on the top of a beach and look down towards the water, and somebody would say to you, how much water does a beach, 1 meter, 1 strip meter of beach filter? It is basically an astonishing figure. For a medium grained, typical beach around 250 micrometers, thereabouts, it's 10,000 liters every day per meter of beach. Now, he actually worked that out for about 6,000 kilometers of beach around Australia, or 75% of all the coastlines of the world being sandy beaches. Shorelines made of sand, pounded by waves, are really the gigantic filters of the oceans. I love this particular diagram, which comes from a textbook, because I think sometimes, making a diagram can be quite fun, and some things are not really all the way in the form of rocket science. So essentially, how does a beach, filter water? The waves come in, they run up the beach, and there's dry sand at the top. Oops, some of it goes in. But what is really astonishing is, and many people do not realize, is most of the return flow of the water having seeped into actually occurs in the subtidal zone below the mean water level. So basically, water circulates through the sand prism as a gigantic, basically recirculating current. Right, one should of course not, I should actually share my screen again. Share the screen. Right, the next part, after we have now summed up the main physical properties of beaches, and we could talk about that of course for hours, is to introduce you to some of the animals living in it. Here is a glorious polychaete. Now, the first thing we need to recognize is life on beaches occurs predominantly under the sand. Occasionally, the invertebrates come out, but mostly they're buried inside the sand. And you can see this sandhopper, a crustacean, headfirst diving into a rather coarse-grained sandy beach. Now, just about 2 weeks ago, a production came out which actually takes, I think, the most extraordinary footage of crustaceans on beaches. And I play this for you guys because, and watch it a few times, I think it's extraordinary. Anybody who actually watches this should be convinced, hopefully, that beaches are more than mere piles of sand. They are rich ecosystems teeming with life. So let's have a look at that.
As the sun sinks behind the waves, these performers awaken and get ready for their all-night show. They take cues from the tides, the moon, and their appetite, emerging from sandy underground burrows. You might know them as sand fleas, but they don't bite, and they aren't fleas. They're called beach hoppers. These crustaceans are as small as an ant, or as large as a cricket. Their eyes are made up of hundreds of cells called ommatidia, but they don't see much detail, just blurry shapes, light and dark. They're drawn towards shadowy blobs on the horizon. They hope it's kelp, their favorite food. When they find it, they eat and eat. Sometimes they even eat one another. This large beach hopper is piercing the other right behind its eye, holding it in place with its claws. For protection, they dig burrows about a foot deep where the sand is damp and cool. And males will fight over control of burrows, especially if there are females inside. Deep in the night, the beach hopper acrobatics build into a dazzling show. The powerful flick of their curled up tail launches them skyward. They do not stick the landing. A beach hopper can jump as high as your knees, dozens of times the length of its body. It's a quick way to travel towards food or mates, or to get out of harm's way. Beach hoppers' diets are mostly beach wrack, anything natural that washes ashore. Wrack is an essential source of nutrients for sandy beach ecosystems. These shredders break down the wrack into smaller parts. It's the first step in sending nutrients into the food chain. When predators like shorebirds or insects eat beach hoppers, they can carry these nutrients further inland. Without these hungry acrobats, beaches the world over would be strewn with rotting seaweed. After a night of fighting and feasting, they leave only silhouettes behind. As the sun rises, the beach hoppers retreat to their burrows just beyond the tide's reach. The performers need their rest. Another spectacle is just a night away. While we're on the subject of unconventional crustaceans, check out this episode about Mantis Shrimp. Their eyes see colors we can't even comprehend. After that, jump on over.
Right, I think this is pretty convincing and pretty cool stuff, and I'm dying to make a video like this about ghost crabs, of which we have a great abundance on our shores. In any case, I think this should actually have convinced everybody how cool beaches are in terms of the invertebrates they host. As a matter of fact, we can find dozens. The world record is about 700 or something like this species of invertebrates on a single beach. And they come from a great variety of animal groups. You see a crustacean here, an isopod. Oops, there goes my microphone. Right, are we still on? Interesting. And here we have a ciliate, which is only a few, maybe 100 micrometers long. Here we got an amphibode, we got whelks, which actually go around sensing, rotten flesh. We got clams, we got epipis here. In many other parts of the world, they're called surf clams. Here we got a tardigrade. Here we got an ostracode, another isopode. We got also insects, which actually feed around the uppermost part of the beach where dead organic material accumulates as a line of organic deposit called the strand line. Here we got a nematode, another isopode. Here we got a habacticoid copepode, and of course types of worms, polychaetes in that case. And this is just a small example of what you can typically, dig out of every square meter of sand on a sandy shore. Often those animals are much more prominent. People know about ghost crabs. You can actually, as we just see here, and I'll show you a few more pictures because we have actually worked on those of teletrid amphipods or of clams or of mole crabs. And sometimes they occur in really, really, really large numbers. We are seeing more and more of those images of herds of buffaloes, but they're not buffaloes really, herds like buffaloes on the prairies emerging out of the sand, feeding on the washed up seaweeds. Sometimes you get mole crabs in large quantities, and often you can get bucket loads of pippies out of a square meter of beach. Now, from an animal's point of view, beaches are perhaps not such a cool place to live, but I would actually call they are maybe a little bit of a challenging one. However, you have to be very careful with terms like challenging and amenable and so forth, because that actually brings our anthropomorphic perspective to the discussion here, or to the description. Many sandy beach animals are actually exquisitely adapted to life in a beach. So what might actually seem harsh to us or challenging might actually be perfectly fine for a clam. We simply don't know. But to actually use beaches as, use descriptors of beaches being harsh and forbidding is simply not true. But two things stand out. We have a lot of hydrodynamic forces, most in the form of wave action. So we are talking about a habitat which is physically controlled, and much of that physical impact on a beach comes in the form of reshaping the beach all the time. But that actually means beaches as a substrate to live at or in are unstable. So the instability of the substrate is a key characteristic, much like we actually find in mudflats, but even more so because mudflats occur in much more physically benign environments, low energy environments, but beaches can be reshaped all the time. And this is why we call beaches to be malleable. For the animal component in beaches, this means one thing, at least for the invertebrates living on an exposed sedimentary coast. There is a high premium for being a really, really good digger into the sand. You want to actually go in very fast and come out very fast. All life on beaches is mobile. There is no such thing as a sessile animal because the beach comes and goes all the time. So you need to be able to respond, sometimes very rapidly. For instance, when you get dislodged by a wave. It also means because the beach is not a uniform environment, but is actually structured in bands with respect to where food lands, where wave action is the most benign or the harshest, where moisture is just right for you to exist, or where fish are down in the surf. Essentially, there's predators, there's food, and so forth. So you actually sometimes want to actually be at the right place at the right time. Since many of those things are predictable because they're governed by waves and by tides in particular, there's a premium here for real intricate behavioral rhythms. So beach animals might seem simple, and I'll show you some examples, but they actually show some quite intricate behaviors. And also, people have often commented on the fact that, well, there might actually not be a lot of food for scavengers around on beaches. I'm not so sure about that really is, but all beach animals, particularly the scavengers, have very, very highly specialized senses of smell and very highly specialized senses of vibrations almost to detect where food is. My father is a botanist, and I grew up in a botanic garden, and I always said to him, look, it's perfectly fine, I'll become a zoologist because I want to actually intellectually advance myself, getting away from that, intellectual, graveyard, which is botany. Only kidding, really. But basically, we all know what the definition is of zoology. Is the science of animals. Easy. And people say, oh, what's the science of, how do we define botany? It's the science of plants. Nope. It's the science of the food of animals. And this is kind of cool on sandy beaches. We don't have notoriously sessile animals, but also no sessile plants, which basically means we can do real science without being, constantly stymied by this kind of annoying plant and vegetation matter. So here is an odd one. When I actually thought, I need to find, some illustration on YouTube about burrowing in beach animals, there's actually dozens to be found. Everything is on YouTube nowadays, and you can actually see those clams. Let's have a look here. Digging into the sand. I think you get the idea. Even for an organism like a pippy or a clam, a surf clam, which you might dig out of the sand, they're actually astonishingly mobile. And that mobility, that very rapid burrowing ability is a hallmark of all sandy beach organisms. And you might say, how do they do that? Well, there's here's another one. I didn't want that. DuckDuckGo. Okay. So yeah, here we got a clam lying on the sand and people are filming that. But it is actually quite astonishing. You can go on the weekend, dig up a few pippies, place them on, and they will actually dig in. Look how the foot comes out. And what does the clam do first? It actually taps. It goes tap, 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 tap. And when you tap on the sand and the sand has a minimum amount of water, it becomes soft. You can all try that. It's got the trophic properties of the sand, and then the clam goes in. But look, it actually goes in bouts. It's not a smooth bowing movement. Why not? Well, the clam, whoops, and here's a bit of a squirting coming out. The basic mechanism is to use a downward anchor and a foot at at alternating times. So this is actually cutting, lengthwise through a shell for illustrative purposes only. So the first thing you actually want to do as a shell, when you want to go down into the sand, is actually you flare out the two halves of your shell. That provides an anchor at the top here. Then you can actually probe with your foot downwards and say, this is where I want to go. Then what you do is you pump blood basically from the top of your body, from around here, all the way down into your foot. Your foot swells up, and that's an anchor then. And then what you do is you use lengthwise muscles and pull the rest of the body down, as you can see here. And then the process starts again. You flare the shells, foot goes down, you dilate the foot, use the lengthwise muscles, pull yourself down. And this is why a clam goes down into the sediment, boom, 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 boom. Right? Pretty cool, I think. Very simple, but extremely effective. Now, we have seen that wonderful new video, very professionally produced, of clams. Need to check the microphone before it falls down on me again. On clams, not on clams, on beach hoppers, on teletreats, and everywhere, I go with my daughter or partner, I just can't help myself, basically, checking under seaweed. And I hope you all adopt that kind of same habit to actually see, what lives underneath. And here we are. That was actually January 2020. I cannot believe we just managed to get back from California, doing some beach work there with Dave and Jenny Dugan. And that's Dave's feed. And as you go and see, this is, Dave Hubbard, one of the more famous beach ecologists of the world. This is, partner Jenny Dugan. Yeah, this is my long-suffering daughter Isabella, going all these food trips. Now, well, she's actually quite seasoned by now. And you can see all these bits and pieces of kelp, being stranded. And then you go to one of them, and this is what actually happens as you actually lift it up. And whoop, it just explodes. And each one of those is a little beach hopper.
And they come out and munch the kelp at night.
And here is a close-up shot of one of those, and we have seen them already in the video beforehand. Now, those beach hoppers have become literally the star performer to study all the intricate behaviors of beach animals the world over. I've done some work on them also, and I will show you that in a second. Now, look at this one. Much of the rhythmicity, why do we have this thing here? Boom. Just down. Much of the rhythmicity in behavior can be related to either tides, the moon, or a combination of the two, and of course they are related, as we will see in, I think, probably 2 or 3 weeks' time. So why is there an evolutionary pressure to synchronize behavior with tides? Well, firstly, everything on a beach is governed by water movement and the interaction between water movement and the sediment. So the food actually strands, moves up and down, but it also means not all parts of a beach are suitable for you to actually hang out, because sometimes the currents are just too strong, so you don't avoid that. Or the tides actually might be too high near the upper shore, and you might not want to actually go out there because you could actually get stranded there and actually dry up in the sun. So what you actually want to do is you want to really optimize the position on the shore, both for feeding and also sometimes for reproduction, to meet your more attractive other half if you are a crustacean. So many animals can actually sense then, the water pressure, which is of course related to the tidal variation in water height, but there is also an internal clock to it, because you can actually keep, many of those critters in perpetual darkness and in the same aquarium where the water level doesn't really change, and they keep on displaying that same behavior for at least a week or 2. So there's an internal clock actually regulating it, but that internal clock needs a little bit of calibration every now and then from real tides in the real world. So you might come across, expressions like circa tidal. That basically means approximately at tidal kind of frequencies. Now, the period from one phase of the tide to the next identical phase is 12.5 hours. For instance, from high tide to high tide is 12.5 hours. This is some work I actually helped Andrew work with a few years ago in South Africa, and we caught those little isopods from the beach. It was actually very hard work, and then they sat in a dark chamber in the basement in a room which was hermetically sealed, so there was almost no stimulus, completely dark. But we had a little infrared light sensor in the aquarium, so every time one of them swam up, we could actually record that. And really, really, really astonishing is, even if there is no external stimuli, comes high tide, whoops, up they go. Next high tide, 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 up they go. And the same pattern can be found at neap tides, although it is actually stronger at spring tide. So not only do they actually regulate their swimming behavior, that's where they come out and feed in the water column and meet potential mates, based on tidal height, but they can further refine that based on whether the tides are very high or lower. Pretty cool. Now here's some of those teletraits again, that's stuff we actually did in Spain. Now we worked on a beach like this. We probably sat somewhere around here, and you rock up there. We rock a wonderful place of the world to actually spend some time. That's the northwestern part of Spain, called Galicia. It's on the Atlantic coast, so it can get reasonably chilly, but the beaches are astonishing. So we basically, when we work with Spanish people, we were about 5 of us in a Mercedes Sprinter van, and I was actually wondering, are we going to go into the field for like 6 years by the amount of food we actually bought just for one night? But that's Spaniards for you, because between each sampling hour, there was another feast. And so essentially 2 people, basically worked on the beach here, and 3 of them cooked permanently the entire night. I also one night flooded my waders in the middle of the night during a cold night, which was particularly fun on the Atlantic. But never mind, the idea was basically to see what periodicity, what behavior beach hoppers show on this particular beach. And what we did, we basically dug traps into the sand from the low water mark into the dunes and actually empty them every hour, and then you can actually count how many animals were active. And what really, really astonished me was how absolutely precise that behavior was. Here's just one example. And basically, the sun only sets here in a decent country with decent daylight saving time at around 10:30. And this particular night, we just, had low tide there. And basically, very precisely, about an hour after low tide, you get this explosion of beach hoppers, as you can see here by the red color. And then as the tide comes in, they actually migrate up the beach because they don't actually get too wet. They don't really like that because they get washed out into the surf. And this is where all the fish basically wait for them and say, ooh, here's a nice morsel of food. And this is high tide, and they're literally all gone. And that repeats night after night. Really, really pretty cool. And this is my own data, so you can actually see this is the distance, basically 0 meters is really the base of the dunes, and we're going seawards down, and we're going landwards up into the dunes. We can also, as I have shown you already at the first example, some of those critters become more active at spring tide and leads to at neap, more at spring again leads to at neap, and so forth and so forth. And here I think is the most astonishing of all, behavioral performers, who has a very, very, very precise activity window. Now, this is a crustacean. It's an isopoda. It's about that long. It's called Tylos, and that's a good morsel of food. Now, they also occur here on Southeast Queensland beaches, but they're extremely rare. In 16,000 samples, I found 2 specimens, and I gave this to my friend Peter Davies at the Queensland Museum, and he literally had a particular bodily reaction I can't possibly mention. But in South Africa, there's quite a lot of them on the beaches. Now, Tylos is quite odd because, believe it or not, they have developed such a semi-terrestrial lifestyle that their gills are reduced, but they go into a moist chamber. And so they almost function like insects. But if you actually put them in water, they drown for, extended periods of time. So Tylos doesn't want to come out, of course. If you're a Tylos, you don't want to actually come out during the day at all because the birds will just spit you off. So the first constraint is you can only be active at night. Now, but you only want to come out at high tide because at low tide, it's a long way to basically, crawl up to the kelp. So you got about a 2-hour basically. Now you only want to come out at low tide because at high tide you actually get washed out to sea. So what basically happens is you got about 2 hours, and those 2 hours have to occur during low tide, and they have to occur at night. I have to close my door because my neighbor started hammering. That should be right. And essentially, because the low tides occur later every night, the first day you might actually go out and you find them, right after sunset. You go out the second night and it's an hour later. And so basically the activity period occurs later and later and later at night until after about 2 weeks, Tyler says, whoops, if I actually get up during low tide now, I will actually be on the beach when the sun has risen. Bad idea. So they reset the entire thing again to start again in the evening. So this is extremely cool in that not only do we have a very precise day-night cycle, but we also have an extremely precise tidal emergence pattern. Now, believe it or not, those little critters can actually orientate themselves very well because they want to actually occur not too high up on the shore, but also not too low down. Too high, you dry up. Too low, you get washed out to sea and the fish eat you. So, how do we know that they can actually orientate themselves? Here is such a simple experiment, but it actually shows, the behavior so neatly of orientation that I actually sort of like, why didn't I actually think about this? This is the Cape Peninsula. Cape Town is right up here. And here's a beach basically sloping that way towards the Atlantic. And this beach over here on the eastern side is sloping that way to the Indian Ocean. The sun actually rises here and goes over and sets over there. So the animals on this beach are seeing the sun more or less in the afternoon, but in relation to a very differently inclined beach than the animals are on the eastern one. And all you have to do then is to demonstrate orientation based on slope is you transport animals from this beach onto that one, let them actually out in the middle and see what actually happens. They basically all run in the wrong direction because they all orientate to the sun, and essentially the sun orientation is in the wrong direction when it comes to the beach slope. If you do the same thing for those ones, and you just basically, this is called a procedural control, you let them out at the right size, and essentially they all migrate into the middle. So very, very neat demonstration that sun orientation takes place in those critters. Here's an even more elegant experiment, and that means as the animals move up from the low shore or move down from the high shore, if you transpose them, because let's say they get displaced or want to come into the optimal feeding zone, they will actually see the sun, right, on different eyes depending on the time of the day. In the late morning, they will actually see the sun on the left, and in the afternoon, they see on the right, and in the afternoon, they see the sun on the left, and in the afternoon, they see the sun on the right. So you can actually do the following. You just, blacken out the left eye here, and essentially the orientation gets destroyed because they cannot see the sun anymore. The organisms which actually still have the eye facing the sun intact, they migrate perfectly. You do the same thing in the afternoon, and all of a sudden is the organisms which again have the eye facing the sun showing normal orientation, and vice versa, the organisms with the eye blackened out show the reverse. So a clear and very simple demonstration that beach hoppers orientate according to the position of the sun during the course of the day. I think it's quite remarkable for a very simple looking animal, at least to most people's eyes. Here's another interesting facet of it. Not only do we have behavior in terms of activity, we also have very intricate orientation. But some organisms also say, okay, well, I literally can suppress my metabolism to almost base levels, but when I come out, it goes up, and then I conserve energy again. So again, metabolic activity is also being controlled by an internal process. Right, here's one of the culprits, which is quite common on our beaches, called, Pseudolama conica, and you can see the size if the paper clip, so it's about that size, a few millimeters long. Now, ecologists, no matter what system they work in, are interested by determining what parts of the environment are really shaping the composition, the diversity, the abundance of our communities, i.e. what is it, what makes a particular ecological assemblage look the way it does. This is a data set collected primarily by folks from the University of Port Elizabeth down here, a few additions from Australia and New Zealand from Jenny Dugan and Anton here in Oman, and by my late friend Alex from Brazil. And essentially, beach ecologists have an incredibly simple predictive model. But it is actually one which is much stronger than in many other parts of intertidal ecology. And you can basically say, give me a very, very simple measure, such as the slope of the beach. Is it like this or is it like this? And I can tell you with a really, really good degree of predictive capability and accuracy, how many species are you going to find, right? And in which abundance are you going to find them, and what their biomass would be. Look at those models here. Now, most ecologists from many other systems would kill for a relationship like this. They measure one particular aspect of the environment, a very, very simple one. That's more or less the morphodynamic state. Beach slope is just one of those measures, and it actually works. The same thing works for grain size and so forth. So essentially what it actually suggests to us is that it is primarily, and I say primarily, but not only, the environmental factors, the environmental conditions of the beach environment which predict how many organisms you're going to find, both in terms of their abundance and in terms of their species identity. By and large, those kind of graphs have been repeated dozens and dozens of times. Flatter beaches, finer grained beaches have more animal life in them than steeper, reflective ones. So I might say, this is actually quite remarkable. How can you get such a very strong relationship, such a consistent relationship, such a relationship which is so repeatable the world over, no matter where you go, and yet only uses a few very, very basic grain size, wave height, beach slope predictors? Well, we actually have to step a little bit back here. This is a wonderful photograph of the Wailing Wall in, you can see here, this is actually, the most sacred site for Jewish people. This is, the mosque at the background here in Jerusalem. And I'm showing you this because about an hour south of there is this kind of environment. It's the Negev Desert. I think Israel is one of those countries which is a little bit underappreciated nowadays by Australians to visit as a destination. I think it is absolutely fascinating. I mean, go there when you have a chance. Never mind, what you actually find in a desert environment like this is, well, there's a bush here, there's a bush here, there's a bush here, there's a bush there, and so forth. They're all separated by bare sand. And there was a desert ecologist in the early mid-70s, Noel Meyer, who was basically formulated a thing called the Ecological Hypothesis. And that basically goes, was developed for those kind of desert plant communities. And it basically goes to the effect, say, oh, well, it doesn't really matter what your neighbors are. Every plant is out there for itself. So in essence, the plant community, as you see it, is just a summed response of individual responses to the abiotic environment. Now, again, being an ecologist is kind of, I think, it's a great job, but it kind of, messes with your brain a bit, as you might tell me babbling along here. Don't comment on that. Sorry about that. But when you actually travel, you just basically, observe the environment around you, there's all these theories, you have heard over the years. And when we were in Chile, like 2 years ago, you're going over this great mountain pass, and I stopped the car and I said, look guys, look at all these desert bushes and these cactuses here. And they're all equally and nicely, spaced. Isn't that just like the old ecological hypothesis? And this is basically, where everybody, gives you a kind of nod and said, yeah, right, Thomas, yeah, just stay calm, we're going to get you a beer, we're going to get you a comfortable place, we're going to get you some food. Don't actually stress yourself too much. Never mind. I even had to take a video and explain it.
I'm just standing here in the park in Chile, and I'm looking at the hillside. And what you can see is a very regular spacing of the vegetation. Cactuses, that's another shrubbery. And that actually is the basis for an ecologically spherical ecological hypothesis, where basically there's regular interaction between individuals, and that actually leads to a distribution of biodiversity where every species just fights for itself. It's called the ecological hypothesis.
But here we go. So you go on your holidays and you make little videos for teaching. Very sad. Never mind. You get the idea. When you see an environment like this, not much competition going on, not much competition going on. The idea is what you see is individual species responses. So here we go. That's basically hopefully the same thing written down, blah, blah, blah. Yep. How lucky am I? And, there's sort of shady character, writing about this for sandy beaches, but it's basically what I just told you, right? So essentially then, how do we explain this kind of relationship, where we have an increase in abundance and biomass, from reflective to, dissipative beaches? One idea is the physical control might become a little bit less, or the biological control might go a little bit up. But basically, none of those is really all that convincing. What we think might actually, this is the same thing, what might actually happen is to explain this really, really, strong relationship here is a mechanism which has something to do with the water flow. Now, I again try to stress on you that what you will see in other parts of, marine ecology, all has to do with biological interactions. We're always fascinated by predation. I work a lot on scavenging. There's quite a bit we're going to talk about, when it comes to competition, commensalism, and so forth. So this is all the yellow box here, biological interactions, right? They seem to determine life as we see it in the ocean. And here we actually have a quite different model. We actually said, what we actually see in terms of composition, diversity, abundance, biomass, blah, 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 is primarily the response of how organisms react to the environment. And then we say, yeah, biological interactions might come in, but probably not all that strong. Now, if you actually posit something like this, you need an mechanism. Now, and what is the mechanism which is thought to actually drive this kind of error? What is the error here really? What does the error really look like in real life? And we actually think it's something called the Swash climate. Now, let's go right back to what I said. So if you want to measure Swash, it's really something very, very difficult to do. Here's an array of remote to actually measure water flow by using the Doppler effect. But basically, measuring water flow in the Swash is not simple. However, you have all basically, an instrument which actually works perfectly well for that, and it's called your feet. Now, if you stand on a beach and it's a reflective beach, firstly, you will actually sense, if you don't have boots on, of course, like you live in Scotland or Norway or Iceland, is that the sand is relatively unpleasant to stand on. It's harsh, it's gritty, it's shelly, like this one here. But what you also notice is that the waves come in and it's a sudden uprush and it's a sudden downrush and it's all a bit turbulent and then it's gone again. And sometimes it actually can sweep you off your feet. And the other, extreme is if you go to the beach on Fraser or Sunshine Beach or Mooloolaba, the waves might be 2 meters high out there, but then they break and then there's the surface. And eventually the wave transforms itself into a swashboard and then a laminar flow comes up and then a laminar flow comes down. And so you stand there, it's very pleasant to stand, it's hardly going to sweep you off your feet. And the flow is literally go back and forth and everything is good. And on top of it, basically, you don't actually feel a lot of turbulence. So what we actually have is a laminar flow, dissipative beaches, and a harsh, dynamic, turbulent flow on reflective beaches. And I should actually warn you, don't try this at home. But I remember when I taught my daughter, swimming, and you take your little toddler, your baby, for the first time at the beach, and you very quickly actually learn where they can stand up. Of course, you hold them by their feet and you're very careful, but essentially, reflective beaches, no good for little babies because they just tumble all over. Reflective, dissipative beaches, they sit there and they're quite happy, because the flows are gentle. And basically, I've never used that analogy before, but you can actually say, beach animals just like little babies? Well, they are in a sense because, or at least we think they are. And that has given rise to an idea called the Swash Exclusion Hypothesis. And it basically goes along, I don't know when my circles transform themselves into Easter eggs here, but never mind. And it goes along the way where you say, look, on a dissipative beach, as I just explained, the swash climate, the flow is benign. It's laminar, it's slow, it's long. So if you're a filter feeding organism, you've got tons of time to actually filter feed. Whereas it is harsh, it is turbulent, it is fast, and it is short on a reflective beach. So you can actually order your species from being the most tolerant to the harsh swash to the kind of, they're not really the tough boys here, species C. And what we actually think might actually happen is, basically from the most tolerant to the harsh swash to the least tolerant ones, essentially the tough boys, they make it everywhere. However, the most sensitive ones, which are maybe not as well adapted to a very dynamic flow environment, they start dropping out. So what you basically get is, on a dissipative beach here, you get more species at high numbers, and on a reflective one, only the very, very toughest ones make it. And that's basically the whole idea about the Swash Exclusion Hypothesis, which is a very attractive and a very widely, used explanatory mechanism, I should say, for sketching, the composition, the variation in the composition, diversity, and abundance of sandy beach invertebrates. You might then say critics, including myself, about the Swash Exclusion Hypothesis is like, well, there's plenty of examples of, biological interactions. And, some other people have said, well, competition on a beach might actually not be all that important because the environment is three-dimensional. So if two species compete, right, for the same resource, they can actually divide their niches up, down to sediment column. Some of them live a little bit deeper, some of them live a little bit shallower. They came out of different times and so forth. Species also are mobile. They can get out of each other's way. And many of them are basically opportunistic feeders, and sometimes we don't actually find everything in great abundance. So all of those factors would actually argue against a strong role of competition. Predation, I think everything which is written here take with an enormous, large grain of salt. But what I say is that the more we actually look at beaches from a truly integrated and I would say more encompassing perspective that includes vertebrates, the more we start to appreciate that actually computation is important. So watch this space. So you might say everything is actually worked out in sandy beach ecology. Well, very, 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 very far from it. What I have shown you so far, and there's going to be another lecture on beaches, but focusing on the vertebrates and the food webs, is correlative evidence only. We need actually desperately more experiments. Very difficult to do. And what we also seem to actually learn, that this is a field in flux. And how it is a field in flux is very easily demonstrated by any textbook on standard marine biology. They're all more or less the same. And sandy beaches, even though they're the single longest interface between the oceans and the land, and it's the one environment that most people interact with the oceans. They usually give them short shrift. It's a few pages, and whatever is written there is not very well written, and it's just sort of sometimes plainly wrong, simply because it is the one environment which has traditionally been neglected by marine biologists, and we are learning new things all the time. So I think this is an enormously interesting one to basically get your teeth into. Right, thanks for listening for 2 hours or something ridiculous to my babbling away on beaches. And here's one of my favorite organisms. Pied oyster catchers on the beach up at Tiva, and we're going to talk about shorebirds very shortly. Thank you.